Good morning. I'm really actually quite happy to have followed Ali because after a very enlightening presentation on what Singapore has done, I'm going to shatter your dreams of what we can do in Calgary. But in all seriousness, sorry, a little joke. Really, the key points I think Ali covered, which are some of the advantages of BIM, which is the ability for a government to actively participate in how BIM becomes implemented, and largely to an extent of how an approvals process can affect how you deliver a building, I think are critical points. And essentially, that's what I'd like to talk about today is the kind of, let's call it newborn project we have at the City of Calgary on how to deal with BIM in the approvals process. And I'd like to walk you through at a high level what we're both doing and what we intend to do and where we'd like to go, because I think it's not only the wave of the future, I think it's a great opportunity for industry and the government to ally their aims and create a much better system for approvals. So I've called this BIM in the approvals business because I really couldn't come up with a better title. But really what it is essentially the question of how we're going to deal with the digital age in the approvals process. Because quite frankly, if you were to write down our approvals process and see our mechanics of how we look at drawings, we are probably better suited to drawing on a board with a pencil in 1962 than we are in a digital world. And that's part confession, part admission, but most relevantly, it's a realistic statement. We simply have processes that are growing antiquated in an industry that's moving forward at a fairly quick pace. So I'd like to cover the usual, the why, what, who, when, but my focus primarily is actually going to be why BIM, to make a case for that, and the how and where BIM can take us. And I have to be quite clear on this. I work in approvals. We work in a future tense for a set of drawings. We look at things that aren't built yet. So as one of the speakers from this afternoon, Megan, eloquently said yesterday, there's a significant difference between the design and construction aspects of BIM and the operations and maintenance. So just so we're all on the same page, we're really talking about the design and construction aspects of BIM and how it works. And because everybody who knows me knows I have to talk in analogs because I'm not smart enough to come up with new stuff, let's talk about building a better building by building a better airplane. This is Boeing's 787 Dreamliner. It's the world's first all-carbon commercial airliner, and I'd like to start here for a couple reasons. First and foremost, I think it's important to note this is an aircraft that was designed not to be a new airplane. And that's a first for Boeing. So Boeing traditionally, when they came out with the 747 after the 737, there's a reason they're very different sizes, different engines, different layouts, different ranges. They were always trying to fit a new niche market. The 787 doesn't do that. The 787 is a replacement for Boeing 757s, 767s, and to a lesser extent 777s. And it's doing that because it's more efficient. They essentially set out with performance goals, and those performance goals were varied. It included increased fuel efficiency, higher cabin humidity for greater passenger comfort, lower operating costs, but those are refinement issues. More importantly, I think, we have to realize that this entire aircraft was designed, tested, constructed, and fabricated digitally. There was very little prototyping done on this, and that's been a hallmark of the last two Boeing designs. But more importantly, I think it is a flagship for where a very sophisticated industry has taken BIM and to its logical conclusions. So what can a 787 teach us? I think we have to note that it is designed by best practices with performance specifications. There is no dummy's guide to how to design a commercial airliner. There are best practices. That provides an immense amount of flexibility. I think that's the kind of flexibility a building industry would embrace. I think we have to realize that Boeing has never ever once built a jet engine. Boeing buys jet engines from small firms like Pratt & Whitney, General Electric, Rolls-Royce. They simply design an airframe to hold them. So they are very common and very comfortable with the idea of both prefabrication and subassemblies. And I think the critical point is Boeing also realizes that if I front load the design process and put accuracy and precision in my design, I automatically put precision in my construction and I save cost, time, money, increase performance. And again, I think that's something as we move forward in the building industry, we have to embrace. And I've essentially would like to summarize that as the Boeing formula for this was performance specification plus good design tools plus an integrated process equals a better airplane. And I'll postulate to you that I can take that exact same formula and apply it to buildings. Now let me say why it's relevant. If we look at the performance specifications, we are rapidly moving into a world where codes become performance design guidelines. So the NECB is the National Energy Code of Canada for buildings. It will give me the recipe on how to come up with an energy efficient building. However, 95% of the applications we see in Calgary use what's called the performance compliance path. So we're not telling people how to get an efficient design, they're demonstrating a performance criteria. That is an immense change in the way we have looked at codes. And all codes are rapidly moving this way. Everything from life safety design to structural design to energy performance is quickly moving from a how-to recipe book to a performance standard and a performance objective. That is a lot closer to an airplane than we've ever been before. I think we have an integrated process that's rapidly burgeoning in construction with the IDP and IPD, integrated design and integrated project delivery. That is a monumental step forward, which is less confrontation in the construction market and more collaboration. The middle one is interesting because it's good design tools. And I will postulate that that is the one area where a 787 and a high-rise tower are exactly the same. Because I think BIM is the tool that one needs in order to do the other two. What's neat about this equation, I have to say, is that if I don't have all three components, it doesn't work. I can't take out a performance specification from this and end up with a better building or better airplane. I can't take out an integrated design process and end up with a superior product. And most certainly, I can't do it without BIM as a collaborative tool. So, how can we move buildings towards 787s? I will reiterate, I think we need an integrated process, and we're going to talk about that in approvals. I think we need to foster collaboration as opposed to confrontation, and that means both between design teams and between things like regulatory authorities. I think we also need to understand all performance goals of a building. And that is something, as a government, we have had trouble with. We have tended to look at segregated performance goals. Is the building safe? That was our standard for years. Now we're asking, is the building safe and is it energy efficient? Any owner will tell you those are two components. I also have to worry about, is it marketable? Is it economic? Does it perform well? Is it leasable? Is it constructible? All issues to do. And when you look at something like a 787, I reiterate, don't underestimate the fact that Boeing took the time to build a 787 based purely on marginal gains in performance. It doesn't get twice the fuel economy of a 767. It gets about 7% better fuel economy. But that's enough. So we have to be very cogent and very cognizant of the implications of performance specifications on a design. So let's look at BIM. If that is the common tool between 787s and buildings, let's see what BIM can do, and let's highlight some of its points. And I think first and foremost, we have to realize it's a communications enabler. We'll talk about that when we talk about a collaborative team in a few minutes. We've drawn plans and sections as a way to convey what the geometries of an object are. We can also convey what the information behind that object is, and I think that's a critical point we'd like to make. BIM is also a process. And again, it is the reason when I say that you cannot segregate any one item out of that equation we just talked about, I can't separate out a BIM tool from an integrated design process. They are one and the same, and they're one and the same for a reason, because they are enablers of each other. And the last one, I think this is most important, especially when we talk about approvals, is BIM is a tool that can change how we, and that's the royal we, that's the industry plus the city. And you could keep adding to that list. You could add owners, constructors, trades, it doesn't matter. How all of us come together to construct that entity, which is known as a building. And it will change the way we do business, and I think for the better. So let's talk about an evolving approvals process. Again, part admission, part confession, part realism. We have an antiquated one to start with. So let's talk about what that might look like. So let's talk with the ideal solution. So do I have a pointer on this thing? I sure do. This is the classic chart that is used to demonstrate why integrated design process is a smart plan. The black line, there, is my ability to change a project as I change the timelines. This thing's hard to point. As I progress its design. The red line is the cost of making changes. Now, this might seem like a bad news story. This is actually, not only is it not a bad news story, it's actually the ideal situation. It is intuitively obvious that the farther I get down a process, the more difficult it is to change and the more expensive that change is going to be. So if this curve, as drastic as it looks, represents the best, let's talk about what we have to deal with in construction. Let's talk about this in the localized context, just because that's what I know best. I actually have a precipitous drop in my ability to change something when I'm doing a building. I also have a corresponding massive increase in cost when I make those changes. So I am far, far from the ideal here. You might ask yourself, well, why is that? I will actually say it's because of our approvals process. So I apologize for the abbreviations, but for the rest of the next 20 minutes together, DP is development permits, BP is building permits. Now, can I get a quick show of hands? Do those words mean any sense to everybody here? Okay, so it's not bad. Okay, good. The reason we have these precipitous drops are, when I do a development permit, I essentially fix a lot of the design aspects of my project. My massing, my distance to property lines, my fenestration distribution, shape of the building, use of the building, height of the building, square footage, all critical aspects of things like energy performance and leasability and marketability and economics. So I automatically take a massive drop in my ability to change. At the building permit stage, I take a massive increase in the costs because I now am dealing with a set that is conventionally also used as my tender set. So changes that are done after a building permit / tender set are inordinately more expensive. Boeing doesn't have to fight that. Boeing is dealing with the idealized curve. You all have to deal with this one, unfortunately. So what if we could propose a system where instead of having a precipitous drop in my ability to change projects and a necessary and corresponding increase in costs, what if we could actually smooth out that curve and have a more segregated and a more consistent review process that enabled me to become closer to the idealized curve that enables Boeing to go build a 787. I think BIM lets us do that. And the reason I think it lets us do that is because of all the things we talked about earlier, which is it's a collaborative tool. It's because it lets me communicate. It's because it lets me share information at any time. When you are effectively dealing with a hardline set of drawings, I'm expecting you in a snapshot, and that snapshot is at the development permit and at the building permit phase. But me as an authority having jurisdiction, that is someone who approves permits, I am expecting you to essentially say, this is my project, like it or love it, and that's it. If we actually had a process that allows us to go through systematic reviews, I don't need you to make those drastic steps and make decisions out of sync with what you would optimally like to do. So if we're talking about a multiple review process, we're actually getting out of the world of simple snapshots and gatekeeping with respect to permitting. We're getting into a world where we can talk about evolving a project, which is, last time I looked, exactly what an integrated design process asks you to do. So we're talking about taking something from pre-application phase, reviewing it multiple times as opposed to singular snapshots at development and building permit, whoops, advancing a slide incrementally, and eventually ending up with a refined project that meets your design intentions and meets our obligations as a reviewing authority. So, how are we going to do this? This is where it gets a little more interesting. I'd like to propose a model for collaboration. That's the strategy I think we should be developing. So let's talk about what collaboration means with respect to, this is the point where I usually like to say I'm from the government and I'm here to help, because that always gets a little bit of a chuckle. But let's talk about BIM and how that's going to work. First of all, I think we have to realize that BIM allows something that no other communication and drawing tool does, which is it allows non-traditional team members to become informed. And a non-traditional team member includes authorities having jurisdiction, approvers. Because as opposed to being a gatekeeper, if I'm doing multiple reviews and you and I can agree on certain aspects of the building, we can start doing things like prioritizing. And when we start to prioritize, we can talk about real-time reviews of things, which is again unique to BIM, that is not existing in our current submissions process, where the review of things like design requirements, your customer needs, your consultant and engineers, and ourselves as an approving authority can all work in the same model in a reasonable time frame. So interestingly enough, when we get to what we're calling an integrated approvals authority, I'll share a little tale about how one of the consultants was saying essentially, well, I don't want to do BIM, but I want to do this process. And I got to say, well, that's impossible. We'll talk about that in a minute. So our challenge is how to collaborate. And my proposal is this, and I think if there's one slide I think that it's important for me and to convey correctly to you, it's this one, so I'll read it directly. And I'll ask you the question, is it feasible to build a parallel approvals process? Parallel meaning we're not throwing out the existing one. So we would build a process that runs in parallel to our existing ones. That combines the development permit and building permit into a single permit, utilizing BIM processes and tools as communications to give continuous feedback, so not snapshots, but a continuous reviewing loop, by a single team dedicated to project facilitated higher performance, more economical building in Calgary. Yeah, you can. There's nothing in that sentence that is actually impossible. It's not easy, but it's not impossible. And it's not impossible because we've seen it done through things like Boeing. So what do we need? We need to change our tools, our expectations, and culture and processes. And when we get to the culture and processes, in order to do this fairly elaborate change, because if you're asking, take it like this, if you take a bureaucrat, of which I am one, and say, I need you to change your tools, your processes, your culture, your philosophy on life, and the way you do your business, you're probably not going to get a lot of buy-in on day one. So I recognize the magnitude of this challenge. In order to do that, we've broken it up into 4 steps. So we're talking about a change in technology, versus a change in process. So on the far end, we're talking about going from paper copies to PDFs. The most simple digitization you can do. Do I find that useful? Yeah, maybe for small projects. Saves printing costs. It has a benefit. This doesn't really float my boat all that much. Moving from PDF format to a BIM model does excite me, because now I can start talking about tools. I can start talking about real-time reviews. I can start talking about actually getting information to and from a client. At the end, we're now talking about an integrated approvals process. So the reason I will highlight this, these first 3 pilots, going from paper copy to PDF format, or first 3 steps, pardon me, paper copy to PDF format to a BIM model, those all utilize our existing process, which, as I say, would remain intact, because we can't ask industry, we can't force industry to wholesale change. We're not Singapore. The last one, an integrated approvals process, is actually a change in procedure. And it's a change in philosophy from how we have currently looked at projects into a more collaborative and more refined model. So, in order to do this, let's talk about this. So we've broken this up essentially into 2 phases to get to an integrated approvals process. Number 1, and this is the one we're currently on, so we'll talk about the where we are as this. Pilot 1, we are currently testing various BIM softwares and piloting projects that have already been permitted. And why are we doing that? We are doing that to familiarize ourselves with the tools we have available. can we actually gather enough information to, in good conscience, issue a building permit from a digital submission? All indicators thus far, absolutely. There's nothing about a building review that cannot be done in a BIM model, provided we are clear on what our expectations is. One of the deliverables of this will not only be us standardizing on a software, and that does not mean, I have to be very clear on this, that does not mean we're going to tell you how to draw, quite the opposite. We need a program that will allow us to get a multitude of file formats in. But more importantly, we want to deliver to industry a guideline that says, when you are making a BIM submission to the City of Calgary, this is the kind of information we would expect, and these are the options you have and how to convey that to us. Why? As I just said to one of my colleagues this morning, we have had 200 years to essentially perfect the way we communicate via hardline drawings. We've had 200 weeks to do that in BIM in Calgary. That's a big difference. It's going to take us some time to write an appropriate set of guidelines, and of course, as always, we are more than welcome for your feedback on that. Pilot 2 is essentially taking the idea of Pilot 1, which is issuing a building permit off of a BIM submission, and putting it into real time for a real project. So that our expectation is sometime in late 2018, or sorry, early 2019, late 2019, we will be accepting a BIM submission from someone. And it'll probably be a City of Calgary project, so when, not if we mess it up slightly, we're paying our own piper. So I don't want to drag you through our process. But the idea is saying, we would love to take this online and make it a reality, where you are not obligated to submit paper documents anymore. You could submit a BIM model on USB, server, however we work out the mechanics, to us, and that is your new building permit submission. I should back up. It is very important to note, those two parts of the integrated approvals process pilot utilize our existing permitting system. So there is nothing, we don't have to invent processes, we just have to perfect our tools and our procedures. Let's get a little more exciting. Let's talk about what an integrated approvals process might be. So as we said before, as we move towards an integrated approvals process, I'm quite interested in the idea of one permit. And what does one permit mean? It means I'm actually dedicating a team at the City of Calgary to review your project for both development and building permits simultaneously, and you and I can agree on what the priorities are. That is very different than a checklist that says, thou shalt submit X, Y, and Z on a building permit application. And I'll use the classic example. If on day 5 of a project, you and I both agree we need a 1-hour fire separation, do I really care how you build that 1-hour separation? Probably not. I might in 6 months' time when I go send an inspector out, but on day 5, as long as you and I can come to a conclusion, we can progress this drawing set. That's very different than what we do now, which is, I need all the information now. That puts a huge onus and a huge change on optimized design processes on the design team. Pilot 4 is, so the difference between pilots 3 and 4, I should explain, is the same idea of a combined development permit, building permit review in an integrated process using BIM. The difference being pilot 4 would take it out to one that involves community engagement. One of the challenges we have as an industry in Calgary is we have a development permit process that effectively allows the public at large to comment on drawings. That is an enormous wild card. The reason I don't like it as a wild card is because if you are expecting to be able to front load engineering into an integrated process and or invest the time and energies to creating a more perfect BIM model for submission, you probably want some surety on what that looks like. We'll talk about that in a second. Again, just to reinforce some points, the above would use a new process. So there is the use of BIM in our existing process for building permit approvals. There is a combined development permit, building permit project using an entirely new parallel process. So please bear that in mind. So what can this do for you? I think it does an awful lot. Let's talk about some of these things that are quite obvious. I think if you are collaborating with industry leaders in their space, so that would mean essentially, let's go to an integrated approvals model. I am now dealing not as somebody who is expecting you to snapshot your building in time, but I am actually going into your world, into your BIM model, not drawing, that's part of the software requirements, is to make sure we don't mess up your drawings, but using appropriate software that would allow us to comment, to flag concerns early, and to allow the design team the space and the intellectual freedom to resolve them to their abilities. It's a lot different than a response, than a requirements list, which is what we currently do. Develop and pilot a parallel online process, so it's a voluntary process. I think that's key. We are not taking away your existing permitting processes. If you like them, God bless you, feel free to use them. But for those who would like a different one, we are more than happy to entertain that notion of a second parallel process. We can review and comment interactively. That's, to me, the biggest key, and why the consultant colleague of mine who said, I like the idea of an integrated approvals process, I don't want to do BIM. Why? Here's why I can't do that for you. I go, I could simply sit in your office for 8 hours a day looking over your shoulder as you draw and go, I don't know, that doesn't seem to meet the bylaw, or Article 3.2.1.4 in the Alberta Building Code has an issue with the limiting distance. We could do that. Your building permit would also cost you 5% of your building construction fee. That's unacceptable. BIM is the tool that allows us to do these interactive, real-time, intelligent commentary in a way that is actually economically feasible for us as an approving authority and for you as an industry. Converging the DP, building permit, and energy codes reviews into one thing. That is how one generates the idea of building to a performance specification. You stop telling people what to do. You start telling them what they ought to do and let them figure it out. Dedicated team, start to finish. One of our greatest challenges is consistency. If I have a planner and someone from building regulations who can both review the drawings and do site inspections, the number of surprises you should have to deal with on site should absolutely plummet. Surprises are very expensive in construction. Let's try to avoid them. And the other ones is pure economy. You minimize paper records, you actually save money. I won't name the name in this room, but somebody once conveyed to me that the cost for doing the development permit prints, because I think we were up to 16 or 17 sets of a large set in full color, was $250,000. What a waste. What an utter waste of trees and money. Let's see if we can go past that. So, let's hypothesize for a second. Let's paint a picture and let me tell you a story. So today, let's say, just hypothetically, I am doing a very simple building. 3 stories, main floor commercial, 2 stories of residential above. A building we literally approve every day, okay? Right now, I'm going to ask you for a development permit set early on in the process. When you've submitted that development permit set to me, or to the city, you have effectively frozen where your windows are, what your size is, what your use is. If you were doing a commercial or retail base, how many CRUs are you going to have? What size are they? God help you if you can't lease them. That's not our concern. We need that on a DP because rules are rules, because reasons. You are talking about something where we are fixing a large number of design issues early on, yet we only do a cursory building permit review. So we don't know we know what you're building, we don't actually know how you're building it, yet we're making comments. After that comes in, and let's be honest, the difference between a development permit submission and a building permit submission can be a year, up to. A year later, you're going to come in with a building permit submission that gets reviewed against your development permit set to make sure you haven't changed anything. Now we're going to dive deep into all the energy code issues, all the building code and life safety issues. We're going to ask you how you constructed every partition on that building, what the area of your glazing is, what the exiting strategy is, what the exits are made from, what the building is made from, and all of its engineering. You haven't tendered this thing yet, but you had to decide all of those decisions. That's an awful lot to add into a process on something that isn't constructed yet. So, in a nutshell, what we have is we have something that change is very difficult on. The system is relatively inflexible, and it makes you make a lot of decisions not to your optimized schedule, but to our schedule. And our being the royal R, which is approvals, economics, everything else. Again, most importantly, and I think this cannot be overestimated, you have exactly one chance to get that right. Boy, that's a tough design problem. That is exactly what you're doing when you submit a development permit or a building permit. Yeah, you can revise it, don't get me wrong, but revisions cost time, energy, effort, all of those things. You effectively have one chance to get that right. What does an integrated approvals process world look like? Well, I'm actually coming in for a DP pre-application, mandatory. That's what our process, as we've outlined it, involves. You're going to come in for a development permit pre-app, and we're going to decide some of the critical features of this building. All right, here's its maximum height. Great. Here's the FAR for the site, the floor area ratio. Great. Here's what it's going to be used as. Great. Go design your pants off. That's exactly what a pre-app should look like. Once you've done that, you will engage the community to make sure they're okay with the go and no-go zones of that design. Then you're going to come in for a permit submission. And that permit submission is going to be digital, and it's going to involve the development permit team and the building permit team. And we're going to collaboratively prioritize what happens. So, hypothetical case again, 2 stories of residential, story of retail on base. You wanted retail on base, great. How many CRUs? 3. Okay, let's do that. Turns out your 3 CRUs are too large to lease. You have to come back to us and say, can I change it to 4? Yes, you can. Today, you have to resubmit your development permit to do that. Why don't we just collaboratively decide if that's okay? At the same time, you're telling me, so we're now on to week 6 of this project. From a building permit perspective, those CRUs, they need a fire separation, between them. Okay. What is it on this building? Hypothetically, 1 hour. Great. How are you going to construct it? Don't care. We've agreed, and BIM will happily document, that we all agreed on this date that it's a 1-hour fire separation. Is it concrete masonry units? Don't know. Is it studs and drywall? Don't care. I care when you go out to install it. That's when that actually matters to us. So if you want to run 3 or 4 different tenders in the meantime, all looking at different ways to construct that 1-hour separation, you're more than welcome to. If your structural engineer gets back to you 7 months into it and says, if we lose the columns and put in load-bearing masonry instead for those CRU walls, we're going to save $150,000. Let's do it. There is nothing in a BIM process where a collaborative model does not allow you to make those kinds of changes. At the end of the day, we have a permit process that would have multiple opportunities, and think back to that idealized curve where we're saying a lot of reviews lets me take that big drop in my ability to change and turns it into a bunch of little drops. I have something where change is encouraged. Because once I can prioritize and once we can agree on certain decisions and document that effectively in a BIM process, the change is automatic. I can integrate the team into your design team in a much more collaborative way, in a much more intelligent way, in a way that saves you time and effort, and ironically, ourselves time and effort. And more importantly, it allows you to optimize your design schedule with your performance goals. So things like tendering no longer become a one-shot, hope I got it right deal. We can actually talk about a system where the approvals process and your economic performance metrics can work hand in hand. So hopefully, in summary, I'd like to think, well, we're nowhere near Singapore yet, and we probably are a long, long way away from digital checking of codes against BIM submissions. I think we have a tremendous opportunity in Calgary to reinvent and I don't use that term lightly, but reinvent an approvals process that would actually allow BIM and integrated design processes to flourish as opposed to being penalized. Thank you very much. Yeah, so the question was, what's the timeline? Excellent question. I have pledged that we will get a BIM submission guideline and pilot run by the end of 2018. That is my obligation to my management, my director. From there, my expectation is we are probably about 6 months later, we should be able to accept BIM in BIM in our existing building permit submissions. The integrated approvals process, I would suggest, because of the complexities dealing mostly with community engagement and development, I would suggest are 2 to 4 years off. But these are not, I mean, let me put it like this. I'm not expecting to retire before we do this, which is, yeah, talk about aim high, right? But the idea of saying is these are eminent changes.
A great presentation. Really enjoyed it, Justin.
Thank you.
The question I have, if I buy into the notion of multiple reviews, which resonates with me, how practical is it in terms of you know, the resources that you need? You've got to devote resources for reviews, time, it means people, and I'd be interested in that response. The sub-question to that is, do you foresee or anticipate that artificial intelligence might be a part of the equation?
Excellent questions again, Kirk. You are correct. It would be ineffective for us to do this on a single family home. We simply don't have the resources. So when we were actually asked, when I was asked by our management team what kind of projects we would expect this to apply to, my off-the-cuff answer was projects with budgets greater than $20 million, and we would have entrance criteria that would include things like an integrated project delivery methodology. So we would actually put the criteria on the applicant to say, we're willing to engage in this process and dedicate the resources to it, but you must be of sufficient size so we have the permit fees to cover it. Very pragmatic. You also must have a contractual structure that allows us to integrate into a collaborative team. So if you were doing, you know, STIP-some warehousing, it's probably going to be a tough sell. But it was mentioned in Raphael's presentation. You look at something like the Cancer Center, which is effectively using a design-build P3, perfect. That is a perfect project for us to have ingratiated ourselves into because its own methodologies would have benefited and would have supported exactly the goals of what we're talking about here. So there is, again, to summarize, there would be likely a minimum budget size and a minimum and a project delivery criteria that we would ask for. Excellent question. I got off easy today. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin.